My name is Corrine Fairbanks. I am Oglala Lakota, and I am with the American Indian Movement.
Okay. What brings you to the Convergence?
There are several different reasons that I came here. One is because I feel it's important to network with as many people and organizations so that we're all collectively working on the same things, but also using the same definitions in the language, not just with each other, but also in the language that we're using against the opposition or the people that want to develop and not believe that climate change is happening.
So there's several things going on at this conference, and I want to ask you about several issues. But one that I believe you've been talking about is sexual exploitation, man camps.
In California, when we talk about man camps, you also have to kind of think about the 49ers. There was a gold rush in California. Okay, they would set up camps to pan for gold. Well, they often would abduct Native women to make sure that their needs were taken care of, and also to try to attract more industry in that. You had saloons. Not all the women that ended up in these houses of ill repute were there by consent. Okay, so there's a historical, I think that people keep doing what has been proven to be successful. So historically, you have that this has been a way of attracting development and progress, is making sure that men's needs are met. And one of those needs they feel is sexual, right? So we take it to where we are right now. And again, I'm bringing that up in development and progress, manifest destiny, how people, westward expansion. This was all along the way, not just in California. This happened with Indian boarding schools. You know, civilize the native, kill the Indian, make them a civilized human being, right? Whatever. So here we are now in 2019. And when we talk about man camps, what we're also talking about, you have these logging situations. Anywhere there's development and progress, needs need to be met. There's always supply and demand. When we talk about sex trafficking, when we talk about murder, missing, and indigenous women, not just indigenous women, this is not a separate indigenous women issue, because it happens to all women. That you know, there hasn't been exact data, because none of these governmental organizations want to work together to get the exact statistics, right? So, but we do know that in Canada and those that live along the border systems, wherever there's commerce and interstates, there's going to be a high rate of indigenous women that are abducted, murdered, missing, unaccounted for, because they're not seen as valuable. So then you have police officers and governmental agencies that don't want to get the data, that don't want to coordinate with reservations, that don't want to coordinate with, all the players in those areas to stop those from happening. They don't want to investigate. We've seen that in Matamoros, we've seen that on the border, the southern border, and it's definitely along the Canadian border. Okay, so again, it's about supply and demand. I was working with a First Nation young woman. I was introduced to her, and I was very connected to her, who she had, in fact, she's part of a documentary too, but her perpetrator had abducted her, made her part of the sex trafficking scene. They had to patrol every night. They would hit a different motel. They were never in the same place, or they would go to trucking camps. It was always the trucking camps or the truck stops that were moving supplies, or like logging, or, you know, they were moving this internationally from Canada to the United States. Her perpetrator, to make sure she wouldn't run away, snipped off her Achilles tendons. I mean, he would keep her pregnant so she wouldn't have menstruation, so she wouldn't have to stop working, and then he would force her to go into labor so that she wouldn't, you know, as she was being shown. I mean, as she was starting to show her pregnancy, right? So one of the points that I made today earlier is that when we come together and do an open call for direct action work against these environmental issues, we also have to keep in mind that these issues affect women. They affect women in a very different way that it's going to affect men organizing on this issue. So if you're a sexual assault survivor and you're working on you're working on trying to do direct action, this is also going to recause trauma for that sexual assault victim that's also working on those direct action issues, right? The other thing that was kind of mentioned too is that as Indigenous women, we understand our direct connection to how this affects us. Just think about it. Mother Earth, the moon, these are both feminine symbols, and the moon specifically deals with the water and the tide. So as you've seen Indigenous women taking the lead as water is life, they're also trying to make it very clear that women are the direct bond between these entities of Mother Earth and the moon and the water and the tides, all life-giving entities, real ancestors, real spiritual beings that manifest themselves physically, right? So many Indigenous elders have said that when you attack the earth, that's what's really going on with what you think about women, the misogyny, the cultural misogyny. Okay, what is capitalism? What is imperialism? What is patriarchy? What is misogyny? It's all connected, and you've heard several Native leaders say that a nation is not dead unless the hearts of the women are dead, because women are the backbone of the culture, of the language, of the social norms, of the education of those children, So there's a lot of connection to that. And I know that coming to this conference, there's been a disconnect. I've heard the word decolonization several times over, but for some reason, people think that that's just a Native Indigenous problem. You guys need to decolonize, not us. And it's just kind of like, no, we all need to decolonize. We are all, in some ways, socially conditioned to be very colonized, thanks to the public school system and the media and, et cetera, et cetera. It can go on and on and on.
Every community knows of people who have been abducted and killed or trafficked, but I am hearing that there's a huge, it's not proportional. So could you give us a feel for what that looks like?
I think you have to take the historical context and see how it's been normalized in mainstream society to not ask questions. When you deal with Indigenous populations having mascots, where we're not even seen as actual human beings, when you have Halloween costumes that run amok and basic Pocahontas, that are very sexualized costumes. So then again, you have Indigenous women not even seen as, they're seen not only as caricatures, but also sexual objects. So to think those kind of thoughts, you know what I mean? So so you've got it normalized in this kind of context as well. That makes things disproportionate. And I'm not saying that there's not other communities that have had to deal with it. They definitely have their share to deal with that sexual objectification as well. However, because Native people seem to be given no voice through the media, no voice, we're seen as a people of the past. The question we get, various questions of like, do you guys still live in a teepee? We're not taught what's happened to our people, even in the public school system. There's no truth and accountability that's even taught publicly. Every holiday that you've got, you have Columbus Day, which thankfully it seems to be moving towards Indigenous Peoples Day, but you still have President's Day. Each one of those presidents had a plan to force assimilation to Native people. We were barely given the right to practice our spirituality publicly in 1978. I was 10 years old. That wasn't 2 generations ago. You know what I mean? So then we barely have 2 people that have gone to to DC to represent, Native Indigenous needs. So there's been levels of invisibility and marginalization, layers of complexity that have kept the voice of Native people and our needs. The fallacy and myth of Thanksgiving, the fact that America doesn't want to be responsible or accountable for their crimes against humanity towards Indigenous people. They've made war heroes out of people that gave smallpox blankets or massacred women and children. Again, women and children, the most vulnerable parts of Native society. So It's a very complex and multi-layered, and then again geographically, I think you're going to find various different answers to that question. And that's the other thing. When you say Native America, you're not taking in consideration that there's almost 600 federally Native American nations in the United States. Very different languages, very dense of spirituality, very different needs, very different geography. So when you say Native America, it's like a fondue pot, fondue. Lumping us all together, thinking we're all the same, thinking our needs are all the same, our histories are the same. There's commonality, but there's specific, differences.
The idea of nature, the idea of genetic engineering. I don't want to project some ideas of spiritualism on you. What's your thought? And what's your thought about engineering nature?
Earlier when I was standing, when I said what I said earlier to the collective, what I wanted to make sure my point is that, so you have Mother Earth, and then you have the moon, and then you have the water, right? These are all life-giving entities. Women are in the center of that because we are also mother, life-giving in the water and all of that. Genetic engineering doesn't address that. I think that it's my personal opinion. Again, you go on with progress and development. Progress and development, the definition, I think the way things are kind of perfect. The way the systems are, the ecological system, when it's left alone, I think it's beautiful, very cleansing. It purges itself. It takes care of business. So how can you even think the arrogance and egoism to try to one-up nature on that? Or think you can do a better job? Whether you believe in evolution or creation, it's really not my place to tell people what they believe in. But I can say strongly, in my opinion, that the way nature kind of came to is perfect the way it is. When you start messing with that, then you fuck everything up,
Is there something I haven't asked you or something you would like to say?
There was a speaker named Winnie yesterday who spoke about indigenous people globally. One of the main points he made was the horrific abuse and sexual assault and aggression done to indigenous women in the development of the deforestation and the tree plantations. And he mentioned Africa, he mentioned Thailand, he mentioned Brazil. So as I'm speaking about indigenous people, I connect with those global struggles as well. So if you're going to sit in the audience and listen to what's happening to indigenous people and what's going on with the deforestation there and not be moved, because one of the things that this sexual assault survivor said to me, the one I told you that had her tendons crushed, she said it in a very humble way. She said, it's scientific. If you abduct a woman and keep killing her child, then you've just killed the future. So again, talk about progress and development. If you want to make sure that there's no descendants left on a sacred space that's perfect for development, you're going to want to get rid of the people that ensure the future of that. How do you do that? You get rid of women that have wombs, or it's a no-brainer.
There's a lot of people, including myself, who want to defend forests, and we hate to see our special places destroyed. We hate to see deforestation overall. But do you think there's mention of sacredness? Is there a different sort of relationship, maybe that idea expresses within indigenous communities?
Yes, and I think that, again, there's not a simple answer for that because, there's indigenous communities all over the world. but one thing we all have in common is the methodology and how we were colonized. And sacred spaces were often built, churches were built over them. Access to these sacred spaces were often denied or quarantined off. So, and our language systems, or at least the language systems that I'm familiar with, are very much connected to the, like our stories of origin, how we believe in ceremony. They're all connected to our land bases. So it's not just a home, but it's an actual living, breathing entity. So there are Native people in the plains that have stories of how we were so connected to animals and to flora and fauna, and to forests, that we could speak to them, and they taught us medicines. So there was communication, there was a relationship, not just with that land. Because believe it or not, I've heard some people that are indigenous to Mexico and Central America that had relationship with rocks that would tell them histories of certain areas. In what we've been told is inanimate, they had history and connection and communication, and they believed in the spirit of that. So I think here we are in 2019, and there's still indigenous people that organize with the knowledge that it's not just a sacred space and spot, but it's also a living, breathing person that needs to be recognized, heard, valued, and I hate the word saved, but definitely kept sacred for the next generations, always the generations, because again, remember, our languages are centered on our land base, right? Our stories of origin are centered on that. So the other component to that is that, I always like to reflect on, President Morales in Bolivia, who he was the first indigenous president, I believe, the first in South America, that clearly stated that Earth has rights, and just as, if not more than human rights, because we are all connected to her, but it's a living, breathing, viable, with connections to, everything's connected to her. We are connected to her, but she's a living, breathing being, and I think that's something that really resonated with me as a Native woman here in the States. I was so happy to hear that, and I really wish that that's another thing that we could push for, and I think that that's missing from the Paris climate agreement. It's, in analysis of that, it's still being seen as a resource rather than a living being, and I think that I know in my own work and the work of mentors and elders that I've worked with, that's how we come to that. That's why we're willing to say by any means necessary, because we're fighting for another person, another being, So.
Well, thank you. I really do appreciate the interview. Is there anything else you would like to say? Anything? If not, that's fine too.
I just want to make sure that what I've shared is not seen in any criticism to the committee or to the convergence here. I think that we all learn as we go along. I certainly don't have some of the same views that I had when I was 20 or 30 or 40. But, these are all opportunities for growth. When we talk about diversity, we have to also be open to hear diverse opinions so that we can only grow wiser and better and more humane, And I think that that's the other thing. When I was speaking to someone in one of our groups, when we were talking about that word, buen vivir, right? And they were saying English, Spanish. Okay, well, there's no more Shawnee here. Okay, they're still here. Those ancestors, those spirits are still here. Their descendants might have been forcibly removed somewhere else, but you don't think that these ancestors found a way to get you here to hear what they had to say to save this area? So when we're talking about, being involved in the sacredness of these sites, or this whole place is sacred, but there's ancestors that still walk around here. They wanted you to be here, They wanted us to all work together. So we can take that as an opportunity to grow, and learn from each other, or walk away really upset that no one, that no one understood your point, or letting egos get involved, letting narcissism take the first hand. So I just try to see this as an opportunity for growth, and I don't know if that made any sense, but
Made very good sense.
Okay.
And I appreciate those words.
oh, okay.